Okay, so welcome to today. Today we will be thinking about the Wetland Adaptation Planning and Practices workshop that we will all be getting together and working together in February, I think February 23rd in Lake Geneva. So the purpose of today is to introduce ourselves, to introduce you to Todd and myself, and just get you guys familiar with some of the topics that we'll be working on at the workshop. So again, if you are listening on the phone or maybe even are part of this webinar now and you haven't signed up officially for the workshop, please get in contact with Todd, myself, or Amy Stephen. We would really like to know that you're coming. You're welcome to attend, but we definitely want to know that you're coming. Okay, so who are we? Well, Todd and I are actually located in Houghton, Michigan. We work for the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science. Todd is actually in Iowa right now, so this is a totally virtual call. But you can sort of see us right here, Todd and myself. The work that we do at NIAX, if you're not familiar with us, is really to work with people to coach them through this idea of scaling climate change down to a site-specific way that is meaningful to their work. We provide practical information and resources to get people thinking about climate change and natural ecosystem management. The emphasis of our work really is in forestry, but we are branching out to plenty of different fields in the field of natural resource management, and this wetland adaptation workshop will be the pilot opportunity for us to think more considerately about non-forested systems. And I'll talk more about that in a little bit. So some of the major outlets of information that you might recognize, if you haven't recognized NIAX before, is through the USDA Forest Service Climate Change Resource Center, the Climate Hubs, maybe the Climate Change Response Framework, or even the Adaptation Workbook.org. So we do provide in a lot of different ways this type of information to people. So I'd welcome you to go and check it out if you haven't checked it out already. Okay, so the purpose of today, the sort of the agenda, our roadmap, looking forward, introduce you to big ideas. I'm going to kick it off with talking more about adaptation and introducing you to the adaptation process that we'll be using at the workshop. And then I'll hand it over to Todd, and Todd will really focus on sort of a brief, it'll be pretty brief because we're not with you for very long, overview of climate changes, starting with observed changes and then moving right into climate impacts. But don't leave too soon. We'll need to hand out some homework at the end of this webinar. And again, ask questions throughout. We're going to try to be really considerate and ask you guys if you have any questions, but if we forget or if you have a burning question, just jump right in. We won't be offended.
Or type questions in the chat box. Either one.
Yeah. Oh, I thought you said there was one. Yeah,
no.
There's plenty of different modes for you to connect with us. Cool. So let me move some of this stuff over so I can see. So before we get into this, I'm sure that some of you have some basic questions about climate change and natural resource management. Maybe you're asking yourself, what does climate change mean for me, and how should I manage these changes? What can I expect? And what are the answers? What should I do? Maybe some of you have signed up for this workshop hoping that we will give you this, crystal ball that will give you all of the answers. But I'm just going to put that out there in the beginning that these answers aren't easy. They're not easy in typical management, and they're not easy in the context of climate change. These are really complex questions. And so you'll find us continually saying to you, the actions that you could take, it all depends on where you are, what your site is like, what the vulnerabilities of your site are, and most importantly, what the goals of your management are. So Although, we won't be able to answer these questions for you, we will coach you through the process so that you can think about climate change in your work after this workshop. But, we will get to some semblance of an answer, not in this webinar, but at the workshop. Okay, so when we think about climate change, I'm sure some of you have some ideas of big actions that you could take to respond to climate change. Some of them might be related to this idea of mitigation, which are actions that help us reduce carbon and other greenhouse gases that are contributing to the warming that we're experiencing now and will experience more into the future. And although those are really important practices and actions to take, they're not necessarily the focus of the workshop. Our workshop will focus on adaptation, which are these actions to prepare for and adjust to new conditions. So although they're concepts that can work together, a person can take both types of actions, a mitigation and an adaptation action. We'll be focusing on adaptation. And when we think about adaptation, we're really thinking about ways to reduce impacts. Reduce impacts, maintain current conditions, or maybe forward-looking, promoting change. There's a continuum of adaptation actions that we could take. Sometimes it's easy to bin ideas into tight little definitions. So we like to think about adaptation as resistance, resilience, or maybe transition actions. Again, these actions reside on the continuum of, reducing impacts to forward-looking. But, life isn't easy. These actions are not discrete. They're often kind of fuzzy. So when we're thinking about adaptation, when we're thinking about moving forward, it's nice to have a starting point to sort of know where you are on this continuum of resistance to transition. But don't beat yourself up too much to get down to the meat of, is this resistance, is this resilience, is this transition, because likely there is a gray area between those where you'll exist. We like to have people think more broadly and generally that, are you managing for persistence? Are you managing to keep the ecosystems in the same recognizable character? Or are you thinking about directing a change and fundamentally doing something different? So when you think about adaptation, I know I put a lot out there on this slide, but I'm hoping to get you more thinking about either managing for persistence or change. I know some of you are probably here and you're initially swimming with these ideas of climate change, big, broad changes that are projected alongside the actual management questions that you have in your day-to-day management. So it's not to say that the actions that you're doing now will be necessarily different in the context of climate change. It's just that we can't necessarily assume that the work that we're doing now will be appropriate given some of the climate changes that are projected. And what I'm getting at is this idea of intentionality, explicitly considering and addressing climate change. That's when we'll know that, we can fully address the climate impacts that are ahead in the context of our management goals. And sure, some of the actions that we're taking now will be perfectly suitable and would buffer changes into the future, but we probably shouldn't hedge our bets on everything we're doing now is perfect and we shouldn't change. This workshop will give us that opportunity to assess risk and vulnerabilities and eventually make plans that are more robust. So the work that we'll be doing at the workshop will be based on a flexible framework of ideas that we've put together at NIAC. And although the resources that we'll bring to the table, the adaptation workbook were created for forest systems, we're totally confident that they'll work in the non-forested systems. And I'll go into more of an explanation on that in just a second. So the resources that we'll provide are designed to be flexible. We assume that all of you are going to walk into the workshop with totally different projects, different places in Wisconsin with very different goals. And that's what we want. We want that diversity of goals and values to be present in the room. So you might be wondering, well, what are we going to do at the workshop? And I'll tell you, here it is. Here's the agenda. We're going to go through this adaptive management process. It's not rocket science, right? It's 5 discrete steps that we'll use in the workshop, an adaptive management project or process for climate change. So it's sort of a never-ending spiral, but we'll stop at the 5 during the workshop. And really simply, what we'll get at is this idea of first coming up with context, having you guys tell us, where are you and what do you care about? And by doing this, this really gives us an idea of our goals for the day and really influences the rest of the process. Next, we'll have you assess and fully document those climate risks that that you'll have to acknowledge given your site's location, maybe its aspect, its latitude, its slope, maybe influences of neighboring land uses. In the 3rd step, we'll take a really critical look at our goals. Do I feel like I can still accomplish my goals? Are they feasible? And if you say, yeah, they are totally feasible and reasonable given climate change, then we'll have you go to step 4. But if not, this is a nice opportunity to maybe go back and revise and edit those goals. In step 4, this is the really fun part, right? This is the brainstorming. This is coming up with those adaptation actions and connecting them to those big, broad concepts of adaptation that I addressed earlier, resistance, resilience, transition. And lastly, this will close out the day that we will have together in February, and we'll think about monitoring. This is really critical. This is where we ask you, what do you need to measure to know and sort of pay attention to in order to know if you're headed in the right direction to that successful outcome that you're envisioning. So again, this is not rocket science, but it is a logical sequence that we'll have you walk through as you learn this process of integrating climate change into your work. One really awesome thing that you guys are going to practice is your penmanship. The fun part about these workshops is that they're interactive. We'll get you up, we'll get you moving, we'll have you talking to people, we'll do activities. But maybe one of the not so fun parts is that we really want you to document everything that you're thinking. And this is because, by documenting our thoughts, we're creating a record of those creative ideas, but we're also creating this really nice narrative that will form your adaptation plan and very likely will serve you into the future because it'll be this really robust plan with all of these different ideas that you've very carefully detailed. So bring a pen or a pencil and get ready to do a lot of really fun work on worksheets. Some of you are thinking, but wait, I can't even attend this workshop. The future is too uncertain. I don't know what to do. How can I adapt and prepare if I don't know what the future holds? And we throw this in here because it's a really common question, right? It's lingering in everyone's hearts. But the reality is, don't hold your breath. There's never going to be a perfect model representation of the future, and in particular for your very particular wetland system in a spot of Wisconsin. So at a certain point, we just have to embrace uncertainty, maybe think of it more as risk management. What are those actions that I can take to reduce risk, and then take advantage of those opportunities to move forward with my goals. So it's not that, there isn't uncertainty. We know that there is. It's just that, we have enough information to move forward now. And just because there's some level of uncertainty doesn't mean that, we shouldn't take action. So cutting to the chase, the purpose of that circle, that cycle diagram that I showed you and all of the talking that I've done so far is really just to say that the work that we will have you go through at the workshop, the purpose is to help you show your intentionality. Tell us, given your goals and your objectives and the place that you're managing on the landscape, how you're going to get from there to a climate action that really thoughtfully thinks about climate change. part of that process is using the resources that we'll have on hand, and I'd ask you to maybe look into them before the workshop, and we'll be basing the work that we're going to be pursuing on this Adaptation Resources publication that includes a menu of adaptation actions and the workbook. And I just talked a little bit about the workbook. Let's talk about the menu. So what makes this workshop really exciting and fun is that we're going to be using new adaptation resources as part of this workshop process. So I'm sure some of you are aware or have been in on it. We at NIAX have been working with the Wisconsin Initiative of Climate Change Impacts, specifically Amy Stason and Ryan O'Connor's group, the Plant and Natural Communities group, to come up with adaptation resources that make sense for the field of practitioners in non-forested wetland systems. So now that we have something that we think is going to work, we want to test it out. So part of this workshop will be actually getting your insight, having you tell us, does this make sense? You know, is this something that you would like your colleagues to use and have as part of their repertoire into the future? I'm not going to get into a lot of specifics on the menu because this is something we'll talk about more at the workshop, and you can look it up in the resource as well. But basically, we'll be using this menu, and essentially the menu is a list of adaptation ideas that are connected to those big, broad concepts of resistance, resilience, transition, and then scale down to more site-specific and ecosystem-based approaches and adaptation approaches. So we start with the big ideas, and then we start scaling down with broad strategies related to ecology and management. You know, for example, one of the strategies might be protect water quality, right? Like that makes sense, but it's still too broad for me to actually use in my management. And then we'll scale down and give you some more specifics, like approaches that make a little bit more sense as you get closer to the ground, such as, you know, favoring or restoring native species and genotypes. You're really getting a little bit more granular. But that's where we stop, because the tactics, the prescriptive site-specific actions, that's what you have to come up with. We will give you examples, but it's really going to be on you to devise those, because that'll be part of the work that you'll be pursuing. So the menu is really part of is the blue line that I've highlighted here. This is where the menu comes in, as that launch pad to help you connect your intentions and make your ideas more specific, and eventually create that clear rationale, which will eventually get you to define intentionality and success. So I've mentioned a whole bunch, but now I'm going to provide you with some links. We have created menus in the past for forested systems, urban forests, agriculture, now non-forested wetlands, and there's a whole slew of other ones that are coming. So just want you to sort of see and feel that a lot of people are thinking about climate change, and you know, there's a lot of resources out there tailored for specific communities of practice. If you'd like to learn a little bit more about how, you know, forested communities in particular are thinking about climate change adaptation, I'd say jump over to forestadaptation.org/demos and just, you know, take a walk through our library of examples. Every adaptation demonstration that's posted on that website, we've been given permission to do so, and each of them have used the adaptation workbook and the process that you guys will be using at our February workshop. So feel free to take a look and get a feel for the diversity of land ownership and goals that are out there, and see how, you know, some of your colleagues are responding to climate change. Okay, so that is all that I have right now. I'm going to ask any questions before I hand it over to Todd.
Yep, and I've muted all the lines, so if you've got a question, you can type it into the chat box or unmute your line. All right, well, I'm not hearing any questions, so feel free to jump in and ask your question at any point here, or type in the chat box. But I'm going to move on. Make sure that I can advance the slides here. All right, that worked. Great. So Danielle just gave you kind of that roadmap of how we like to approach this whole idea of integrating climate change into our management decision making, using the adaptation workbook, using those menus of adaptation strategies and approaches. And you guys are going to be trying these things on at the workshop in February. It makes sense to spend a little bit of time actually talking about climate change here. So we're not, this could be a whole semester long course really talking about climate change. And so we're really going to kind of just touch the tip of the iceberg here with it. But we wanted to kind of prime the pump a little bit and get you thinking about climate change and hopefully increase your understanding a little bit about what climate change holds for Wisconsin and what that means for wetlands. So, as I said, we could spend a lot of time talking about it. Here's some of the highlights of observed climate change. So here we've got some statistics on what are some of the what the records are telling us of how the climate has already changed. So in general, annual temperatures have increased almost 2 degrees Fahrenheit in the last 120 some years since 1895. The largest increases in temperature have been observed in winter temperatures, so over 3 degrees Fahrenheit over the long-term climate record. Changes in precipitation in general has shown that things are getting wetter on average, so almost an increase of 3 inches more of rain in the last 115 years. Spatially, that's kind of spotty, or at least I shouldn't say spotty. It's variable. So when you actually look at the maps, you can see a lot of spatial variability just within the state of Wisconsin in changes in annual precipitation. What's really, I think, more robust is our understanding of how extreme events have changed over time. And so there's a lot more frequent extreme rain events that have been occurring, and we kind of classify these as precipitation events that are over 3 inches or more. And we've seen a big increase of those in the last 30 years or so. At the same time that things are getting wetter on average, we're also seeing that those extended drought periods during the growing season are getting more frequent as well. And that's kind of being driven by those increases in temperature. We're getting more frequent heat spells, so kind of several days in a row where we've got temperatures over 90 or 95 degrees are becoming more frequent, and that's driving more intense evapotranspiration, drying out the soils and making conditions more stressful for vegetation. So that's like a real brief synopsis. There's a lot of places where you can find more information out, and I really encourage you to go out and explore, look in and see what is out there in terms of information on climate change. There's the National Climate Assessment. The volume 1 of the most recent or current National Climate Assessment was released a couple of months ago. The Climate Science Special Report. Sorry, my connection okay, there we go, I'm back. So the Climate Science Special Report came out. You can find that, or you can download that document. NIAX has produced ecosystem vulnerability assessments. We've got one for northern Wisconsin. It's got a ton of great information. NOAA Climate at a Glance has downloadable data And there's a whole, what's not on here is the Wisconsin Initiative on Climate Change Impacts Wiki website's got a bunch of great maps of climate change observations and future projections. So that's a great resource as well. And then, of course, at the Wisconsin Wetlands Association meeting, we're going to have the symposium. Dan Vimont's going to be presenting there. He's going to have a bunch of really useful information to kind of have those climate change impacts sort of front and center in your mind as we go into that workshop. So we encourage you to make sure you see his presentation. Okay. Danielle, I lost my connection there for a second, and now I lost control of the slide. So can you share that with me again? Great, thank you. See if this works. Sorry about the technical difficulties. My internet apparently is unstable here, and so I lost my connection. Okay, there we go. We're back in business. So I briefly went over some of those observations of how the climate has already changed. Here, let's look at some projections for how the climate is expected to change into the future. Here we're looking at temperatures. We see that squiggly orange line is the observed temperature changes in the state of Wisconsin. This comes from the NOAA state climate summaries, which you can download on the NOAA website. And you can see that gray area kind of surrounding it those are the modeled temperature changes. And you can see the models do a pretty good job of predicting. Much of that squiggly line is in the gray area. And that just kind of shows that, you know, our models are pretty good at predicting temperature changes, understanding kind of what those forcing factors are. And so looking into the future, we can use those global climate models to project what temperatures may look like into the future. However, some of that is dependent upon what we as humans do in terms of the emissions of greenhouse gases into the future. So we oftentimes, we look at climate projections into the future based on scenarios of greenhouse gas emissions. And so what you can see here is that how the temperature may change into the future is really going to be affected by what those emission scenarios are. All right, I'm trying to advance slides and it's a little slow. Sorry about this, everyone.
I can advance it, Todd.
Okay. Okay, great. So here is that kind of summary again of what the climate projections are for those same categories that we looked at a few slides ago. You can see it's a lot of more of the same, of what's already happened. And so more increasing temperatures. You can see the range there from 2 to 9 degrees Fahrenheit above where we're already at now. And that range is largely due to the variation or those different climate emission scenarios. You know, more warming in the winter, and as winters warm, more of the precipitation then is going to fall as rain, and so less snow, about a 10 to 30% reduction in snowfall. Things are going to continue to get wetter, particularly in certain seasons, such as winter and spring may get wetter, and more frequent extreme rain events as well. So along with those changes in precipitation and temperature, we're going to see probably longer growing seasons extended by up to 2 months, and more frequent periods of dry conditions or low soil moisture, particularly at the end of the growing season. Okay, can you advance the slide? Okay, So we can say with a fairly high amount of certainty, that the temperatures are going to be increasing. And here's some maps that you can find on the Wiki Climate Change website, just showing temperature projections for Wisconsin. I believe these are for mid-century. You can see on the top there for 2055. And I believe these are the high emission scenario. So this is kind of the worst case scenario in terms of temperature increases. And you can see up to 9 degrees there for northwest part of the state. So hotter days are going to become more frequent, fewer days below 0 degrees Fahrenheit in the winter, and those more frequent and longer heat waves. Precipitation, you can see overall precipitation is projected to increase by mid-century up to 3 inches. That's highest sort of in the areas of the state that are going to be impacted by the weather from the Great Lakes. So, kind of in the northern portion and northeast Wisconsin, less so in the western part of the state. But that is also supposed to or projected to play out into changes to the snowpack and of course to impacts in hydrology as well. Okay, next slide. We have a little bit less certainty with some of the particulars about temperature and precipitation. So our models are really good at giving us information about what the trends are. We know it's going to get warmer. We know it's going to get wetter. We have a little less confidence in saying how fast those changes are going to occur. The models aren't as good at understanding what some of those feedbacks are going to be. So how are the oceans going to respond, for example, to these changes? So things like La Nina or El Nino, those kind of feedbacks, the models are still getting better at incorporating those feedbacks. So some of those aspects, are a little, have a little more uncertainty associated with them. Okay, next slide. Great, thanks. So it can really feel overwhelming to look at all of these changes and think about, what does this mean for me? What does this mean for my management? We don't have all the time that we would need to really go into the deep dive of understanding these things. So, we encourage you to look at some of the resources that are out there, such as the vulnerability assessment, which is linked down in the bottom corner of the slide here. But it really helps to think about sort of pathways of impacts. You can kind of think about those primary changes in climate, those changes in temperature and precipitation, and think about the pathway of the impact to what does that mean for some of the physical conditions that impact our ecosystem, and then what are those then downstream ecosystem impacts. And then as you think about this, you can kind of create a narrative of how those primary changes in climate may play out for your particular ecosystem that you're thinking about in your management. Okay, next slide. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit now about that. We've kind of covered those primary climate changes. What does that mean for ecosystems? Okay, next slide. Well, so you could probably remember from your primary biology classes that CO2 is what plants use to in the process of photosynthesis, and so increasing carbon dioxide levels is one of those impacts on ecosystems that you oftentimes hear about with climate change. Next slide. So you can probably remember from that basic biology class that plants take up CO2 through their stomata. They use light energy then to fix that CO2 into glucose that they use for both growth and maintenance respiration processes. And so with increasing CO2 levels, plants are expected to get more efficient with that. And because they don't have to have their stomata opened as much to get the same amount of carbon, and plants lose water through their stomata, they can then increase their water use efficiency, meaning they can fix the same amount of carbon for at less expense for water. And so, those represent kind of an opportunity for ecosystems. And when we look at ecosystem productivity and how it's changed in the recent decades, we see that ecosystems are getting more productive. Forests are getting more productive. But we think that there's probably a limit to that positive benefit of increased carbon dioxide. We know that plants generally aren't carbon limited. They're usually limited in some other resource, such as nitrogen. Other changes to the environment, such as ozone, are probably going to limit some of that benefit as well. And then, things like moisture stress, things like disturbance are probably going to really have kind of swamp out those effects. And when you look at some modeling studies, they show that ecosystems are probably going to be more productive in the future when you don't include disturbance in those models. But when you put disturbance into those models, you oftentimes see that benefit kind of goes away over time. So in general, those increases in temperature is going to lead to longer growing seasons. So this represents an opportunity here, right? This is a longer period of time for plants to grow. But again, there's kind of that downside to that, which is that those longer growing seasons represent certain risks. One of those is that non-native plants oftentimes have a little bit more phenotypic plasticity in them, so they can break bud or start photosynthesizing faster than some of our native plants are. So those longer growing seasons may make invasive species a little bit more of a challenge. Also, things like frost damage, when we have these early springs, but then we get these kind of late spring frosts that can also cause some frost damage as well, which can be a challenge. Okay, next slide. And here's just some maps that show, oops, go back, there we go. Here's a map that just kind of shows from the vulnerability assessment that NIAX published in 2014, just what those changes in season length look like. So you can see in the low emission scenarios, we're looking at, for most of the state of Wisconsin, at least 2 or 3 weeks, and in some portions of northern Wisconsin, even more, up to 4 weeks. And then, of course, under the high emission scenario where warming is supposed to be most intense, we see that kind of by the end of this century, we could be gaining up to 7 weeks of growing season length. Okay, next slide. So this, of course, has implications for our winters. With longer growing season means shorter winter. It also means that those increases in temperature are going to result in less snow. So kind of across the board, less snow cover, less snow depth, and that publication from 2015 there, Notaro was projecting up to 50% decrease in snowfall for the region. It also means that the snowpack is probably going to have a shorter duration as well, which is exposing then soils and the roots in those soils to more frost damage potentially. It also has probably going to have a pretty big impact on some of the biogeochemistry processes that happen, those nutrient cycling processes that happen in the soil. And so you can see on those maps from the vulnerability assessment that under a high emission scenario for the northern portion of the state, a pretty big decrease in the duration of the snowpack. So that's up to 50 days, fewer days of snow cover on the ground. So pretty big changes. Of course, shorter winters also means that more of our precipitation is going to fall in the form of rain than snow. And this is going to have potentially some pretty big impacts on the water balance and on hydrology. And this is, I think probably something that as wetland managers is probably going to be a big concern for managing wetlands. So, we're going to probably see earlier spring peak flows, which is going to also create potentially more flashiness in stream systems as we get more extreme precipitation events. And basically, kind of change the timing and amount of stream flow, as well as groundwater recharge too. So, these changes in the amount of precipitation and as well as temperature is really going to drive changes in hydrology. And so I think this is kind of going to be one of the bigger concerns that we're going to think about from the perspective of wetlands. Those increases in temperature increase water loss from both transpiration as well as water losses from soils and open water. And so that's going to drive changes in water balance for our systems. This is a map of projected changes in vapor pressure deficit, right? So this is kind of, you can think of this as the dryness of the air. Because temperature is going to increase, that may really increase the ability of the air to pull water out of soils and water, open water systems, as well as drawing water out of plant leaves. And so you can see that there's going to potentially, with that higher emission scenario, be a pretty large increase in the drying effect of air across the region. That covers almost the entire state. All right, next. As we mentioned before, extreme precipitation has been increasing and is projected to continue to increase. This is a big concern for infrastructure, a big concern for stream systems, has a lot of potential for for causing damage and a lot of erosion. So a lot more runoff and less water maintained or retained in our systems. And so, just overall, both, these changes in water balance from much greater transpiration is, really increases our risk of moisture stress and drought. And so that, I think, is just kind of a thing that we're going to really be thinking a lot more about. Okay, next slide. With these changes in precipitation and temperature, that's going to have likely effects on species assemblages in our ecosystems. In forestry, we've got some tools that we can use to kind of look at how species range shifts might occur. We don't have as much information for wetland, especially for non-forested wetlands. So, it's going to be a little bit more of a challenge to make those predictions. And another challenge also is just how species are going to move. So this is a map of Wisconsin that shows isolated wetlands. And so because wetlands are oftentimes isolated both physically and also hydrologically on the landscape, understanding how species may move with these shifts in temperature and precipitation is going to be a challenge for us.
Hey Todd, this is Danielle. We don't have a ton of time left, so I'm wondering if there's maybe just a couple key slides that we can move through, or maybe we can have people look at the interactions afterwards and cut to. So I'll give you a chance to wrap it up if you'd like.
Why don't you go ahead and forward through the slides? I really wish I had control here. Yeah, let's just keep going. We've already talked about extreme events, and I think we have a pretty good understanding of insects and diseases. This has a lot to do with forest systems. Invasives are definitely a big concern, and climate change just makes invasive species more of a concern. And I think the main point here is just that oftentimes climate change just represents an opportunity for these different stressors to kind of work together as compounding stressors or a threat multiplier, that they kind of can begin to add up, and sort of intensifying their effects. Yeah, I think you can keep going across. Okay, here I just want to point out here that that the folks at Wiki and the Natural Plant Communities Working Group put together these really awesome fact sheets on wetland vulnerability. There's a link there, and you should really check these out if you haven't already. There's a ton of great information here. Okay. You can skip past this one. We kind of already talked about these pathways of interactions. I think really the point that we want you to really consider is that we need to take, to really make this issue of climate change, relevant to us on the scale of what we're doing in our management. We really need to kind of take those regional impacts and think about our specific location where we're working. So thinking about kind of what is unique about our site, what are the site conditions like that we can kind of figure out what's the top kind of the top 5 or whatever, the most important climate change impacts that are going to be important for your site. And that's really what this adaptation workbook process is trying to get us to think about. So it's really about our location and what's unique about it.
Great. Right. Thank you so much, Todd. That is a lot to cover in the very scant amount of time that we gave you. So if anyone is interested in talking to Todd more about this, Todd is actually one of the authors on the National Climate Assessment for the Midwest region. So he's got a lot of really great science papers and resources we can point you to. I noticed that there were a few slides where we were pointing you to our NIAC forest vulnerability assessments. And although I think that those are great narratives that might help you sort of do that mental downscaling of what does a broad climate change impact mean for a natural system, you might want to save your time and go to the Wiki vulnerability assessments that we pointed out. We should have added those, that link to a few more slides. So I will make sure to share a URL with you at the end of the webinar. Okay, so let's get to the meat of what you guys need to have in order. We're hoping over the next week. Okay, so one of the big things I hope that you have already gained from this webinar is this question of you need to come with a very specific place, a project, in order to really get down to the nitty-gritty of coming up with an adaptation plan. I'm showing you, a cute little diagram here. It's not necessarily something that needs to take a ton of effort. We're asking you, if you're a manager, to take literally a project off of your desk, take a very familiar place that you can reflect on and use that in our workshop. So, maybe it's the Northern Sedge Meadow over by the Northern Great Lakes Visitor Center, or an emergent marsh. But just don't be that guy that doesn't have anything, because it'll take you twice as long to move through the process if you have to come up with a hypothetical place on Unicorn Planet. So I've seen it done. It just takes a lot longer to come up with a hypothetical. So what we will have you do is at the end of, right after this webinar, I'll send out an email and we will give you a worksheet. And in that worksheet, you can open it up and it will walk you through the step 1 of the adaptation workbook. And essentially what we're trying to get you to do is just write down some details about the place that you would like to think about and integrate climate change into that management planning. So we came up with some pretty lame ideas right here, but to give you an idea of the type of effort you need to put forth, it's pretty minimal. You know, maybe it's the wetland next to Highway 2. It doesn't have to have a fancy name, but we do really want you to focus on that second column. Just take some time and come up with clear goals and objectives, because if you do that work now, it will save you a ton of headache and just heartache at the workshop in general, and it will expedite the whole thing. So we will send you the worksheet. And then when you guys send it to us in 1 week, we're hoping, over that time, between the time that you've sent us the worksheet and the workshop, we'll be working with you guys to, you know, we'll get you on the phone. Todd and I will talk to you more about the project that you've selected, and then we'll start pairing people into groups. So things to remember before the workshop. There is no single answer. People will make different choices, and that's okay. And that gets back to that idea of every site is unique and every management goal is different, and that will set very different trajectories for any given site. So don't expect that you're going to walk out with the same management plan as somebody else. It's just not possible. But we will really, you know, we will force you to think about this in the local context and use your own judgment and experience, because adaptation vulnerability assessments really only get us so far. They're big, they're broad. What you need to bring to the table is your understanding of the site and the site's characteristics that probably only you or, you know, your colleagues who aren't going to be there know the most about. One thing to keep in mind is don't be afraid of maybe leaving with similar actions to what you're already doing. That's okay. Adaptation actions might not look different from current management. Many of the actions that people come up with are pretty similar BMPs to what they're already doing. It just makes those actions more important, right? Some of you will come up with really nice adjustments to the type of work that you're doing and making it, you know, maybe improving the effectiveness or directing it at a very specific place on your site. But we're hoping all of you will come up with something a little new and different. Maybe it's something that you're not going to recommend to implement, but we really want to have you use this experience, this workshop, this interactive setting to brainstorm and get creative with all of the really neat people that you're going to meet. So before the workshop, here's a bunch of do's. As Todd was saying, you know, get comfortable with regional climate projections. We know that climate change is big and scary, but you know, we have a ton of resources to help bring that down to earth. So if you go to forestadaptation.org/WI-wetlands, I've put a list of resources you can follow up on, but most importantly, you know, check out those wiki plants and natural community group vulnerability assessments. If you get a chance, leaf through the adaptation workbook. I'll bring a stack of these books with us so that we can use them in the workshop. But the more that you know about the types of information that we're going to ask you to put in the worksheet, the better. And lastly, remember that you have to go to the symposium, the Wetlands Association Symposium on Thursday, where you will get to hear Todd and I talk again. You'll be sick of us by Friday afternoon. Most importantly, complete step 1. And between then and now, you know, we're open to you guys bugging us at any time of day. So please give us a call or an email, and we will definitely get back to you. So I think I've run over time by just about 5 minutes. But if anybody has any questions, feel free to shoot them out. Otherwise, we'll see you in February. So take some questions if you've got them. Okay, Amy is saying the Wednesday symposium is optional but highly encouraged, and obviously that's where you're going to see Dan Beaumont, so you have to go on Wednesday. Okay, then I guess we will talk to you guys soon. Look for some annoying emails from me and Todd, and we will be in touch between now and February 23rd. Have a great day, you guys.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
All right, see you in February.
All right, bye-bye.
All right, bye.